we're from Tigerland. In any weather you will see us with a grin, risking head and skin. If we're behind then never mind, we'll fight and win, for we're from Tigerland. We never weaken till the final siren's gone. Like the tiger of old, we're strong and we're bold, for we're from Tigerland.
Yellow and black! No.
It's kind of an interesting thing sitting here and talking about Richmond winning the premiership. Not because they weren't necessarily expected to or anything, but you could reasonably say at the halfway point of the year that Richmond were quite a long way off the mark on getting a second premiership in the span of 3 years. In the start of 2019, Richmond wasn't the team that we had sort of come to know. You know, Richmond's game plan of super high intensity football is just not sustainable over a long period of time, ergo, you know, a few years running. We saw that with Ross Lyon's St Kilda in the late 2010s, also in the mid 2010s with Fremantle, how they just, you know, these teams after such a long exposure of super high intensity football kind of just drop off a map because injuries starts coming on to you know, players and everything once their bodies are just not able to, you know, maintain that level of intensity over the course of many years. And I was actually thinking that this was going to be the case at the start of 2019 for Richmond. Obviously, the end of 2018, well, 2018 in and of itself, Richmond, you know, finished the minor premiers. They went out in the prelim quite badly, unfortunately, but they were probably the clear best team for the year. Really only, you know, West Coast could challenge for that mantle, but I think it's pretty unanimously agreed that Richmond in 2018 was probably the best team of the year when you take the whole year as a whole. So coming into 2019, I think most people's expectations were that Richmond would be thereabouts again, at the very least top 4, top 2 maybe. They'd be there for the big dance sort of thing. That was the general consensus. I came into the season a little bit different. I thought that the toll that the players had taken over this sort of high intensity journey of football being played since 2017 would kind of result in some of the older players just kind of breaking down with regards to injuries and stuff. And it was happening at the start of the year. I kind of felt a little bit justified in you know, my thought process and everything with that. But by all means, to Richmond's credit and their strength and conditioning team and programs put in place to prevent the things like this from happening, even though, you know, some players kind of broke down a bit throughout the year and at the start of the year, by the midway that was kind of fixed, which is almost unheard of in a season of football, to be able to fix per se injuries by the halfway point of the year. You know, Jack Rewalt comes back. Cochin is still a little bit in and out of the team, but for the most part he's in the team more than he's out. Tom Lynch is pretty well over his PCL injuries. You could definitely see at the start of the year he was still struggling a little bit. Maybe it was just confidence in his body. Perhaps it was just a bit of pain going through the knee or whatever the case might be. But come the halfway point of the year, he had a lot more mobility compared to the start of the year. And I mean, you really couldn't praise Richmond's strength and conditioning and medical team higher than what they were able to achieve, you know, come to the halfway point of the year. It's an absolutely remarkable thing. And to be perfectly honest, if it wasn't for that conditioning team and everything, Richmond don't get this premiership. Their key players stay out of the team and they don't even make a preliminary final. In fact, they probably don't even make finals, because that at the halfway point of the year was an actual threat for Richmond. If you go to round 7, which is about a third of the way through the year, Richmond are actually sitting out of the 8. They're on 94%, coming off of a really bad loss. And they were looking like really patchy. Their ledger was 4-3, so they're only just breaking even. Their percentage is lower than 100%, which is not great when you've got more wins than losses. It's actually not a great position to be in. And so it could be argued that as of round 7, a third of the way through the year, Richmond were kind of dropping off, and it did definitely actually look to be that way. Richmond weren't playing particularly well. I mean, you look at the opening game, Richmond versus Carlton, and yeah, the final margin is a decent margin. It's over 30 points, but when you actually go back and watch that game, Richmond were at serious risk of losing it all the way up until about 10 minutes until the end of the game. And then you go some weeks down the track and they have some big losses, they get some minor wins. They're just not looking, like 2017 and 2018 Richmond that we'd sort of come to expect from them. Alex Rance going down in the first game of the year was a really big hurting point for them, because he's probably going to be missing the entire year. In fact, he did actually miss the entire year. Tom Lynch was very clearly not very mobile in the forward line, and he really needed Jack Riewoldt in there to be able to chop him out as the main man a bit. And then Jack Riewoldt kind of goes down with injury. He's basically out almost for the entire first half of the year. If you want to go a bit further and get to about the actual halfway point, after round 12, the Tigers have just lost to Geelong. In fact, to paint a picture even a bit duller, I suppose, the following week Richmond come up against the Crows and they lose that game as well. So they come into their bye after round 13. 7 wins, 6 losses, 94% or thereabouts. They're in 8th position. Nothing's looking great for Richmond. They've had a couple of good wins, don't get me wrong, and their backline of Grimes and Asprey is actually looking really solid, but the midfield is just not functioning very well. Tom Lynch, although he's had a couple of bags where he's scored, a handful of goals. It was a game that he kicked 6 goals in at the start of the year, or in the first half of the year, but I was never really convinced by that game. He never actually looked imposing in that game, which is really odd to say considering he's a player that kicked 6 goals on the day. He just didn't look imposing to me, so I was a bit skeptical that in the second half of the year, he would regain that mobility that he had kind of been known for. A bit of time was needed for him, but definitely the addition of Jack Riewoldt back into the side in the second half of the year really helped out Tom Lynch. And I suppose the general consensus with the forward line problems for Richmond was that Tom Lynch would come into the forward line and just sort of upset the mould, upset the chemistry of the forward line that has been sort of a bit of a staple mark for Richmond over the last couple of years. But then by, say, the second half of the year, things would just start to click and fall into place. And really, when you actually go back and look at it in hindsight, that's exactly what happened. Pretty much everyone in the AFL media was basically saying that, myself included. But after a bit of a patchy first half of the year, Richmond would go to not lose a game for the rest of the year. As it currently stands, heading into round 1 for 2020, Richmond are actually sitting on a 12-game win streak. What's even more impressive, I suppose, is that Richmond go from 8th spot coming into round 14 with 92%. After the home and away season ended, Richmond are in 3rd position with a healthy just shy of 114%. In fact, when you really actually break it down, Richmond only actually left the MCG once for their last 10 matches of the year. So I don't know how the AFL managed to fixture that. I do know that Richmond travelled a fair bit in the first half of the year, but I don't know how you can justify what is effectively 9 out of 10 home games in the back half of the year. That's really hard to justify for any team. At the very least you could do is you can split some of that interstate travel up throughout the entirety of the year instead of having all of it at the front half of the year and then having none of it in the back half of the year. In fact, the only reason that Richmond even travelled that 1 game out of 10 was for the first week of finals. So it's not even a fixturing issue per se. If it wasn't for that quirk, Richmond wouldn't have left the MCG regardless of whether it was a home game or not, which I just think is a bit ridiculous. I'm not sure how that actually happened. The game of the year, effectively what was kind of the grand final, I suppose, was round 22 against West Coast. Richmond would actually go on to win by 6 points. The game itself was just epic. They were the two premiership favourites by a pretty well long stretch of the margin. In fact, even though Geelong and Brisbane played each other, who were first and second position on the ladder, and despite that game going down to be a winning margin of only 1 point to Brisbane, the Richmond and West Coast game was just of a higher quality. It was much more enjoyable to watch, which is why it was sort of kind of given the title of being the grand final sort of thing of 2019, at least in most people's perspective. At least it's better than what we actually got. They were really the best team in the final. No team actually looked remotely close to beating them. They played 3 games. The qualifying final against Brisbane up in Brisbane. So being on the home deck, a lot of people were actually tipping Brisbane to win the game. But a lack of finals experience and obviously Richmond excelling in high pressure situations and high pressure games were definitely going to be making that quite difficult for the Lions, and difficult did they make it when they ended up downing the Lions by 47 points, which to be perfectly honest could have been a lot less if Brisbane were actually able to kick straight. So they get a week off, get to freshen up. It's really good. There's a lot of talk surrounding whether Alex Rance will make a return or not, and he rules himself out of that equation. Against Geelong, yeah, it's a really interesting game, the Geelong one. It's a preliminary final. Geelong at half-time are 20-odd points up. They look not necessarily in control, but they've taken the controlling aspect away from Richmond, which is important. They're 20 points up. They just need to keep the momentum going. It's just a matter of, can they actually keep that high intensity pressure up that we know Richmond definitely will? And, well, no, they don't. Richmond come back and they take the lead before three-quarter time, and then extend that lead out throughout the course of the rest of the game. So Richmond make the grand final. And it's a game like the grand final, like the 2019 grand final, where you see Richmond's specialty come into the fore. Their entire game plan, Richmond's entire game plan is designed to win final. Its game plan will get it to finals. In what position? Well, that's up to debate, because over the course of the entire season, it's pretty well impossible to play a high-intensity brand of football week in and week out. There will be some weeks where you drop off on that intensity and you tend to drop some games from that. But it is in finals where you want that game plan on your side. To play a game plan that is like, I suppose, Hawthorn's in their three-peat, which is a kick mark, keepies off kind of game plan. Hawthorn never actually really employed that game plan throughout the final. Throughout the year, that is the team that they were known for. A high kicking team with high precision and keeping the ball away from the opponent. But to suggest that that was their only game plan, particularly in finals, is a bit deceiving. You got to remember that there were players in this team like Grant Birchall, Luke Hodge, Jordan Lewis. These guys are tough and they love a good shirt front. Make no mistake, that Hawthorn era was a super high pressure team. They just didn't tackle a lot. They applied outside pressure instead and forced teams to make mistakes on the outside rather than on the inside. Richmond, however, have a similar take on things in that they provide high amounts of pressure, but they prefer to put the pressure on the inside rather than the outside. To do it over the course of just the back end of the year and finals, especially when you have a 2-week break for the pre-finals bye and the qualifying final win bye, players are fresh for the prelim and the grand final, And in a game like a grand final, you want a lot of pressure. And boy, a lot of pressure Richmond bring. Now, don't get me wrong, the first quarter was actually really good watching if you were a fan of either Richmond or GWS. It was a really tight, close game. The margin was just outside a goal at quarter time. So it was a really close, contested game, and it was probably a game that everyone was excited to go on to watch. The question being, much like it was in the prelim, could GWS maintain that high intensity? And given the fact that they actually brought in some injured players into the game, like Lockie Whitfield and Phil Davis, no. The Giants would only go on to score another 2 goals and 1 behind for the following 3 quarters. And let me make it known to you that that wasn't necessarily because GWS were playing particularly poorly. Richmond were just absolutely ruthless. Want some context for that? Alright. The 2019 Grand Final Richmond team, according to Champion Data, produced the highest amount of pressure acts in any game in any Grand Final ever. And I'm sorry, Richmond, for ever doubting you. I'm sorry that your start of the year brought these unwavering doubts upon me. It won't happen again. And in celebration of the Richmond Premiership, as much as it pains me, here's the song. Oh, we're from Tigerland, a fighting fury, we're from Tigerland. And anywhere that you will see us with a grin, risking head and shin. If we're behind it, never mind, fight and win. We're from Tigerland. We'll never weaken till the final siren's gone. Like the Tigers of old, we're strong and we're bold. Oh, we're from Tiger, yellow and black, and we're from Tigerland. So, how do you rate a team that wins a premiership? It's a pretty clear A+, right? I'm not so sure. The start of the year for Richmond wasn't great by any stretch of the means. They lost a lot of players to player and conditioning reasonings, and it took a while for the players to gel and start performing well together as a cohesive unit, which kind of says a lot about the pre-season that goes into the campaign to start the year off. What happened in the pre-season that didn't allow the players to gel, within the first month of the season? Why did it take 2 to 3 months for that system to finally take place? It's a big question mark that I dare say Damien Hardwick will be wanting answered in this pre-season. Although in saying that, credit where credit is due, the medical conditioning staff, coaching staff, and everyone from the top all the way down to the bottom was able to at least identify what was going wrong, fix it, and then improve it to be able to even get into a position to make a grand final, let alone perform the way that they did. So there's some points that have got to be sort of taken off of them. There's some points that could potentially be put back onto them. I don't think that they get an A+ for me, but they do definitely get an A. What am I going to do? Give them an A-? Oh, it's good job winning the Premier. You should have done better than win a premiership. You should have walked away this year with 2. And with that, unfortunately, or fortunately for those of you that have been following all of the reviews, this is the last review for the 2019 AFL Club reviews. I'll put a card right here for the playlist of the 2019 AFL Club reviews, where you can watch any and or all of the team reviews that we've done throughout the course of the off season. By all means, if you did like this review, make sure you leave a thumbs up. Subscribe to AFL Access. We do have some content coming over the off season for you to enjoy, to get that footy fix of yours. And obviously, press that bell to get notifications when we do actually release the videos. That would be nice. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching this review and watching the series of reviews if that's what you've done. We thank you very much for your continued support. And finally, again, congratulations, Richmond. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.